Northern Botswana, late afternoon. The air was still, the heat pressed low, and the grass lay flat where animals had passed in the morning. Elias was walking the edge of a shallow gully when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to wind or bird. It was low and broken, each note falling away before it found its strength. He stopped listening. The calls came again, uneven and close, somewhere beyond a stand of acacia whose thin shadows lay long across the dust. He stepped slowly through the brittle stems, his boots brushing the dry seed heads, and the shape came into view. A lioness crouched in the half-shade, her flanks moving with shallow, unsteady breaths. Her fur was dust-dulled, and fine tremors ran along her sides as if she had been holding her position for hours. Pressed tight against her belly were two cubs, no more than a few weeks old. One shifted faintly, its small tail twitching once before stilling again. The other lay completely still, its head turned awkwardly, ribs barely visible beneath the thin skin. Elias stayed where he was, counting the distance. The lioness's head was low, her eyes half-lidded but fixed, watching him without raising her lips. She made no move to leave, only bent her neck toward the unmoving cub, touching it with the side of her face. The sound he had heard was her, the low rumble breaking into a moan, repeated every few moments, as though each call might draw life back into the small body. A pair of doves flew up from the grass behind her, but she did not turn. She kept her front paws tucked in close, tail flat against the ground, keeping the cubs within the arc of her body. A faint mark showed on the still cub's neck, no fresh blood but the fur was matted. Elias knew it could be the result of rough handling during a move, or even an injury from another predator. Out here, such wounds could turn quickly. If the cub was weak enough to stay down, it would not last through the night without feeding or warmth. The second cub nuzzled at its mother's belly, seeking milk, its movements restless. She shifted slightly to allow it access, but her other forelegs stayed pressed to the still cub's flank. A soft breath lifted the tiny ribs, barely perceptible. Elias let out his own breath, slower this time. There was life there, but the thread was thin. He knew any closer movement might break the fragile calm. If she saw him as a threat, she could carry both cubs away, and in their condition the weaker one might not survive the relocation. Still, if she stayed here without food or water, her own strength would fail, and with it the chance for either cub to live. The ground beneath the acacia was hard-packed, ringed with fallen pods. Overhead, small weaver birds flickered between branches, their calls sharp and brief. The air smelled faintly of dust and sun-warmed bark. Elias stayed in place, one hand resting lightly on the strap of his field bag. He let his weight settle, showing no rush. A faint breeze stirred the lioness's mane, lifting a line of dust from her back. She blinked slowly, eyes heavy, then bent once more to touch the still cub with her nose. The small body shivered, not from cold, but in a weak, reflexive jerk, and Elias felt a shift in his chest. It was alive, and that meant there was still something that could be done. If she moved away now, the cub would be beyond his reach. If she stayed too long in this heat without water, her milk would fail. The choice of when or whether to act would rest on what happened next. He remained, breathing evenly, watching the tremor pass through the cub again. The lioness's low call followed, steady and unbroken this time, carrying across the grass like a line held taut in the fading day. The cub's sides rose and fell in shallow, uneven pulls, each one pausing too long before the next. The movement was there, but it was thin, as if the body was only half in the world. The lioness shifted her weight and bent low, her muzzle pressing into the cub's neck, nudging gently, then more firmly. Her breath stirred the fine dust clinging to its fur. Each time she lifted her head, a sound came, a low moan that quivered at the end, carrying into the dry air before breaking apart. The heat pressed close now. The grass held no movement except for the tremble of seed heads in the breeze. A cicada's call rattled from somewhere nearby, loud in the stillness. Elias stayed on one knee, the sun on his shoulder, counting the slow pattern of the cub's breaths. It was too slow. The lioness tried again, licking along the cub's flank with short, brisk strokes, the way a mother might to rouse a newborn. The other cub stirred at the movement and climbed awkwardly over its sibling to reach her belly. She allowed it to feed, but kept her head turned toward the weaker one. Elias knew the risk in stepping closer. If she read his presence as a threat, she might take both cubs into deeper cover, away from his sight. A move like that, over ground this rough, could finish what weakness had already begun. But if she stayed here, still and guarding, the heat and thirst would wear her down before she could hunt again. Both paths carried the same end if nothing changed. The cub gave a small, jerking twitch, its paw curling in toward its chest. The lioness froze. Eyes fixed on its face. She lowered her head until their noses touched, then breathed against it as though coaxing air into the tiny lungs. For a moment there was nothing. Then a thin, cracked sound escaped the cub. Not a cry, not even a whimper, but a proof that the lungs still held something. Elias's hand tightened on the strap of his bag. He had water, but he could not offer it without crossing the line between witness and intrusion. "Easy, girl," he murmured, the words barely carrying. She did not look at him. Her gaze stayed on the cub as she began to lick its head in small, precise movements, pausing only to nudge it again with her nose. Flies gathered at the corner of the cub's eyes, and she brushed them away with one swift pass of her tongue. The sun pressed harder now, its weight heavy on every surface. Elias could feel the heat rising off the ground, carrying the scent of dust and old grass. If the cub's breathing slowed further, there would be no turning it back. If it found enough strength to feed, even for a moment, it might last through the day. The second cub finished suckling and rolled onto its side, stretching its legs in the small patch of shade. The lioness stayed bent over the weaker one, her tail flicking once, sharply, as if warning off invisible threats. Elias kept his place, every sense trained on the next breath. When it came, it was faint, but more regular. Another followed, shallow but quicker than before. She licked again, working along its ribs, her own sides moving with the effort. He knew the bond between them was all that held the cub to life now. Breaking it could end everything. And yet doing nothing carried the same shadow, a quiet, slow loss, measured one breath at a time. Elias eased himself down onto the hard earth, keeping a careful distance that would neither threaten nor abandon. The lioness's eyes flicked toward him once, then back to the small body between her paws. Her breathing was still shallow, her sides shifting in slow rhythm against the curve of the cub's. He spoke in a low, steady voice, the words carrying no meaning to her but soft enough to blend into the air like another part of the heat. From the edge of his bag he drew a shallow metal bowl. The sun glinted on its rim as he set it down between them in the open patch of dust. He poured water from his flask, the trickle catching the lioness's attention. Her ears twitched, and her head lifted slightly, but she did not move her body from where it pressed against the cub's. Elias kept his posture loose, angled away from her, showing he would not advance. She stayed still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on him as though weighing the space. Then, with a low grunt, she shifted forward just enough to reach the bowl, stretching her neck so her paws and the cubs beneath them never left the ground. Her tongue touched the surface in slow, deliberate laps. Drops clung to her whiskers and fell back into the dust. She drank like an animal conserving itself, stopping after only a handful of mouthfuls before lowering her head again to the cubs. The weaker cub's chest rose and fell, the motion faint but more regular than before. Each time its ribs lifted, Elias counted it quietly in his mind. The rhythm kept him anchored in place. This was the only measure that mattered, that the breath did not slow, that the pause between each lift did not stretch too far. The other cub pressed against its mother's belly, tiny paws needing for milk. She accommodated the movement, curling one foreleg to cradle the smaller body while her other paw still covered the weakened one. The tip of her tail rested across its flank, a light, protective weight. Around them, the reserve was empty of sound except for the small shifts of grass in the wind and the occasional dry crack of seed pods under the sun. Elias could feel the warmth radiating from the ground through his trousers, the kind of heat that would drain strength from any living thing if it lingered too long. He knew that for the cub to survive, the lioness would eventually have to move to hunt. But each minute here, close and still, gave the weaker one the contact it needed to hold on to the thin thread of life. He kept speaking at intervals, nothing more than a murmur. "Stay, girl. You're doing well." She gave no sign of hearing except for the flick of one ear toward the sound. When the wind shifted, he caught the faint musk of her coat and the milky scent of the cubs. The bowl sat half full between them, untouched since her short drink. Elias didn't move to take it away. As long as she stayed near it, there was a chance she would drink again without leaving the cubs exposed. The light was beginning to soften as the sun tilted west. The cub's chest still moved. That single fact held him where he was, legs aching from stillness, eyes fixed on the rise and fall that told him it was not yet time to decide between stepping in or stepping away. As the heat bled out of the land, the air turned cool enough for the breath to hang faintly in front of the lioness's muzzle. The sky deepened to a dark, unbroken blue, and the acacia's branches cast no shadow now, only a tangle of darker shapes above her. Elias stayed where he had been all afternoon, shifting only enough to keep his muscles from locking. In the stillness, every small sound carried: the rustle of the lioness's coat as she moved, the faint mew of the stronger cub, the slow whisper of grass as it bent in the breeze. Through the hours, she never left the small arc of earth beneath the tree. She changed position often, lying half on her side to curl around the cubs, then rising to sit with the weaker one between her forelegs. Each time she moved, she bent low to lick its face, working the short fur in small, deliberate strokes. Between these sessions, she nosed its shoulder or pressed her muzzle against its side, as if feeling for the breath beneath her own. The cub gave no cry, only the smallest twitch of its ear, or a shiver along its flank in answer. The other cub stayed close to her belly, nursing when it could, then curling in the warmth between her legs. It gave a soft, regular mew that was almost lost in the night air, the sound a reminder of the strength that still remained in at least one of her young. Elias knew that the weaker cub, if it slipped much further, would not find its way back. Without the will to feed, the body would fade before the first light. Every so often the lioness lifted her head and scanned the darkness, ears forward, nostrils wide. Somewhere far off, a hyena called, the sound falling flat over the ground. She made no move to answer. But her tail twitched once in the dust before she lowered her head again to the cubs. Elias unfastened his flask once, drinking slowly so the sound would not startle her. The water was cool, but the night was not cold enough to threaten them yet. What would threaten them was the balance between hunger and rest. The longer she stayed here, the longer she went without food, and if she left before the weaker cub could rise, she might have to choose between carrying it and carrying the stronger one. She shifted again, drawing the still cub into the hollow of her body, her forelegs folding like a barrier against the night air. Elias watched the slow lift of her sides, matching it unconsciously with his own breathing. Now and then, her tongue passed over the cub's head, lingering a moment longer each time. It was a rhythm meant to rouse, to remind the small body that the world was still here. The hours passed without sleep for either of them. The breeze carried the scent of the dry earth and the faint sweetness of acacia pods. Insects droned and faded. Somewhere beyond the reach of the moonlight, an owl's low call marked the passing of time. Elias stayed, rooted by the truth that leaving would mean not knowing if the first breath after dawn still came. And if it didn't, if the chest stopped its rise and fall before the horizon broke, there would be no way to turn it back. The first light came as a thin band along the horizon, pale against the dark line of trees. The air was still cool, the grass tipped with a faint sheen of dew. Elias had not moved far through the night, only shifting his weight when the ache in his knees became too sharp. His eyes were fixed on the small hollow between the lioness's forelegs, waiting for some change, some proof that the night had not been for nothing. It came without warning. The still cub stirred, its head lifting a few centimeters from the dust. The movement was small, trembling with effort, but it broke the long, heavy stillness. A thin cry followed, cracked and short, but sharp enough to cut through the morning quiet. The lioness froze, her ears flicking forward, her gaze locked on the cub. For a long breath she did not move, as if listening for the sound again. Then she bent her head and began to groom it in slow, deliberate strokes, her tongue rasping over its face, ears, and down the length of its back. The stronger cub woke at the sound, pressing against its sibling, mewling softly. The weaker one shifted its legs, the tiny paws flexing against the ground. Elias saw the back legs twitch, a faint push as though testing their own weight. It was clumsy, without coordination, but it was motion. The air seemed to change around him, the tight edge of weighting easing into something lighter. The lioness worked over the cub methodically, pausing now and then to nudge it into a slightly different position. Each time she did, its legs moved again, jerking at first, then pressing more firmly into the dust. She licked along its ribs, and Elias could see the small chest moving in quicker rhythm than it had the day before. The breaths were still shallow, but they came without the long pauses that had marked the night. He stayed quiet, only letting his own shoulders loosen as the minutes passed. The light strengthened, spilling into the open ground and warming the air. A pair of guinea fowl moved through the grass behind him, their low clucks soft in the distance. The lioness ignored them, her focus entirely on the cub. Once, the weaker cub tried to push itself upright, its head lifting higher before the effort gave way and it sank back down. The lioness responded with another series of licks, circling its head and neck as though coaxing it to try again. Elias knew that even this small exertion was a turning point. If the cub had enough energy to move against the ground, it had enough to feed, and that would be the difference between recovery and loss. The stronger cub settled beside its sibling, pressing its body along the smaller frame. Their mother adjusted her stance, curling slightly so both were tucked under her chest. She glanced once toward the bowl of water still in the dust, but made no move to leave. The sun was climbing now, burning away the cool. Elias shifted his position, careful not to draw her gaze for long. The sight of the cub's legs moving again anchored him in place. It was no guarantee. The day ahead could still take what the night had given. But for the first time since he'd found them, there was more than just breath to count. There was motion, faint but determined against the earth. By mid-morning, the heat had begun to settle again, the air wavering above the open ground. The lioness shifted, rising slowly to her feet for the first time since the cub had stirred. The movement revealed both young at her paws, the smaller one pressed so tightly against her foreleg it seemed part of her. She stood with her body low, her head turning toward the horizon. Elias followed her gaze. Across the pale grass, shapes moved, slow, deliberate, and closing the distance. At first, they were only shadows against the light, but as they came nearer, the outlines sharpened into lions. 4 in all. Their pace unhurried but direct, shoulders rolling under sun-marked coats. Dust clung to their legs, lifting in faint clouds around their paws. The lioness stepped forward a few paces, then stopped. The cubs stayed between her legs, one crouching low, the other swaying unsteadily but managing to stand. She waited, her tail held low, her ears forward in a steady, measuring stance. The approaching lions spread slightly, arranging themselves in a loose half-circle as they drew within a few body lengths. Their eyes moved first to her, then downward to the cubs. The focus lingered on the smaller of the two. Its uneven stance, its narrow frame, the way it leaned into its mother's foreleg for balance. One of the lions, a large female with a torn ear, stepped closer, her nose lifting as she drew in the scent. The lioness did not move aside but gave a low, brief rumble, not of warning but of declaration. The others paused, their heads turning toward the sound. In the stillness, Elias could hear the soft panting of the stronger cub, the slower breath of its sibling, and the faint crunch of paws shifting on dry earth. The half-circle tightened by a pace, no aggression in their posture but no casualness either. The female with the torn ear bent her head low, her whiskers brushing the smaller cub's back. The cub flinched but did not fall. She drew away without hurry, her gaze lifting again to the mother. Another lion, younger, with a pale mane just beginning to show, leaned forward to sniff at the stronger cub before circling behind the lioness to inspect both from the other side. Elias watched the balance of it. A pride could reject a cub that showed weakness, leaving it to the elements, or they could absorb it, folding it into the moving wall of the group. Which way this would turn rested in the unspoken exchange between them now. Scent, posture, the absence or presence of challenge. The lioness adjusted her stance so that both cubs were pressed to her chest, her head held high. Her tail swayed once, slow and even. The torn-eared female stepped back a few paces, then turned her head to look at the others. One by one, they lowered themselves into the dust, their bodies angled inward toward the cubs. The half-circle held, not as a barrier, but as a quiet enclosure. The lioness lowered her head to nudge the smaller cub, encouraging it to take a step forward. It managed to before sinking to its haunches, its sides moving quickly with the effort. The eyes of pride stayed on it, the space between them and the small frame now charged with silent judgment. Elias could feel the air tighten, the outcome still uncertain. If they accepted the cub, it would gain more than protection. It would gain the shared vigilance and warmth of the group. If they turned away, the mother's long night would have been only a brief reprieve. The circle began to shift, not outward, but inward. One by one, the lions rose from the dust and approached the mother and her young. There was no rush, no flash of teeth, only the slow, deliberate closeness of animals measuring one another in silence. The torn-eared female was first, lowering her head to nose the stronger cub before moving toward the smaller one. Her whiskers brushed its flank, and the cub flinched but stayed upright. She circled it once, then stepped aside without pushing it away. A second lion, broad-shouldered and scarred along his muzzle, followed. He leaned down to breathe in the cub's scent, his nostrils flaring once. The small body shifted unsteadily under the weight of his attention, then steadied when his breath passed. He moved on, brushing his side along the mother's in an unhurried line. The lioness allowed it, her head turning to follow his movement but her paws staying fixed in place. Then came the moment that settled the air. The youngest adult, a lean female with pale eyes, approached the smaller cub from the side and lay down beside it in the dust. She did not touch it at first, only letting her body form a wall against the open space. The cub hesitated, swaying on its thin legs, then leaned into her shoulder. The female adjusted slightly, allowing its head to rest against her. The mother stepped back half a pace, not away but enough to give room. Her gaze stayed on the pair, steady and unreadable, but the tightness in her posture eased. She licked the stronger cub once across the head, then sat beside them, her tail curled loosely around her paws. The other adults moved closer, their bodies forming a loose ring again, this time with no gap. Some lay down, others stood, but all kept their heads low, their attention shifting between the cubs and their mother. There was no tension now, no signs of rejection. The smaller cub's breathing remained quick, but its eyes stayed open, and the rise and fall of its sides no longer faltered. Elias watched from his distance, the scene holding more weight than any step he could take forward. The acceptance was not loud or ceremonial. It was in the way the female stayed still under the cub's lean, in the lack of challenge in the other's eyes, in the mother's choice to keep her place rather than draw the cub back to her chest. In the shade that fell across them, the two cubs shifted closer together. The stronger one nuzzled its sibling, then settled with its back pressed into the pale-eyed female's side. The mother lowered herself onto her belly, resting her head on her paws, but her eyes stayed open, scanning the ring that now enclosed her young. Elias understood the change. Alone, the lioness would have had to hunt, guard, and warm the cubs by herself. An impossible task with one so weak. In pride, the cub had more than its mother's care. It had the shared protection of many bodies, the safety of others willing to hold their place beside it. It was the best chance it would ever have to see the next season. The light softened as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the long shadows of the acacia stretching thin across the ground. The pride began to stir. One by one, the adults rose from the dust, shaking grit from their coats, their tails flicking lazily in the cooling air. The pale-eyed female stood first, pausing to nudge the smaller cub before stepping forward a few paces. The torn-eared lioness followed, her head low, eyes scanning the open plain ahead. In the center, the cubs shifted uncertainly. The stronger one moved quickly to its mother's side, brushing along her leg. The smaller cub stood slower, swaying for a moment before taking a tentative step toward the space between the adults. The mother moved alongside it, her flank close enough to steady its unbalanced gait. The pride closed in around them without command, a loose but unbroken wall of bodies, leaving no side exposed. Elias watched as they began to walk, their pace unhurried but steady. Dust lifted under each step, hanging briefly in the low light before falling back to earth. The cubs were almost hidden now, only the tops of their small heads and the flick of their tails visible between the legs of the adults. The smaller one stumbled once, catching its paw on a tuft of grass, but an adult's shoulder brushed against it, keeping it upright without slowing the group. They moved toward the open plain, where the grass lay in pale waves under the late sun. The land ahead offered no cover, but the pride's shape was protection enough. In that moving ring, the cubs could travel without fear of the predators that watched the edges of dusk. When they reached the open ground, the mother glanced back once. Her gaze found Elias where he knelt among the brittle stems, her eyes steady, unreadable in the fading light. It was only a moment before she turned again, following the line of the others into the plain. Elias did not follow. He stayed where he was, the bowl still in the dust beside him, its water warmed and still, the sound of their paws, soft, deliberate, rhythmic, carried over the dry earth long after the pride had begun to fade into the distance. The sun dropped lower, the sky washing into muted gold and pale rose. The shapes of the lions grew smaller, blending into the waves of grass until only the movement of the tallest stalks marked their path. Elias kept his eyes on that last faint trail until even it was gone, leaving the plain as it had been before, quiet, open, and holding only the memory of the small steps that had passed through,